today we are confronted with the need to outline the principles that will regulate the protest, the exercise of the right to freedom of association and assembly. And this advisory is applicable to the conduct of all protests in Nigeria and other actions leading to the enjoyment of the rights to freedom of association and peaceful assembly and other associated rights. The advisory is targeted at all persons and authorities exercising powers over law enforcement, security, intelligence, and military affairs. All persons exercising executive, legislative, and judicial powers in the federal, state, or local government. All persons organizing protests and assemblies in Nigeria by whatever name called, and who seek to enjoy or realize the aforesaid rights to freedom of association and assembly and all the associated rights and duties thereto. All civil society, media, and professional organizations and bodies who have mandate to promote the rule of law, accountability, good governance, peace, and human rights in accordance with the fundamental rights and fundamental objectives and directive principles of state policy enshrined in the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Now, these guidelines are based on normative principles and legal enactments that legitimize them and make them binding for all these authorities to respect this advisory. We recall that Section 40 of the Nigerian Constitution guarantees the right to peaceful assembly and association, stating that every person shall be entitled to assemble freely and associate with other persons, and in particular, he or she may form or belong to any political party, trade union, or any other association for the protection of his interests. Also, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, Article 11, provides that every individual shall have the right to assemble freely with others, and the exercise of this right shall be subject to only necessary restrictions provided by the law, in particular, those enacted in the interest of public safety, health and ethics, and right of freedom of others. Of course, you know that Nigeria has already domesticated the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, so it is part of the domestic law of Nigeria. Of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 20 states that everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Also, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in Article 21 guarantees the right to peaceful assembly, stipulating that no restrictions may be placed on the exercise of this right other than those imposed in conformity with the law and which are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security or public safety, public order, the protection of public health or morals, or the protection of the rights and freedom of others. There are other associated rights which align with the right to freedom of association and assembly, and these are also enumerated. They are closely tied to the enjoyment of the right to freedom of association and assembly, which is the right to express your opinion freely, which is guaranteed by Section 39 of the Constitution, Section 33 of the Constitution also imposes an obligation on law enforcement and security agencies deployed to protest, as well as organizers of protests and their supporters. The right to freedom of assembly and protest has also been decided in cases. If you remember the case of Inspector General of Police and All Nigerian People's Party and others, 2007, AHLR 179. And in that report, the Court of Appeal laid down the judicial principles recognizing the preeminent position of the right to freedom of association, right to freedom of association and assembly. The Court of Appeal held that the right to demonstrate and the right to protest on matters of public concern are rights which are in the public interest and that which individuals must possess and which they should exercise without impediment as long as no wrongful act is done. Now, these decisions align with international human rights standards regarding freedom of association and assembly, reinforcing Nigeria's commitment to upholding these rights within its democratic framework under the principles that citizens do not require police permit to hold protests. Notification to law enforcement about planned assemblies does not equate to seeking permission, but serves as an avenue for ensuring safety and orderly conduct of protests and assemblies, and that law enforcement agencies must respect citizens' rights while maintaining public order without infringing upon constitutional freedoms, and that citizens and protesters have the consequential obligations to ensure orderly conduct, respect of law, and the security of other citizens and the public and private properties. It is very, very important that the right to freedom of association and assembly are respected. Accordingly, the General Comment 37 to the right to peaceful assembly represents us with the following unique value for the enjoyment of human rights and freedom of promotion of democracy. Comment number 37 says, the right of peaceful assembly enables individuals to express themselves collectively and to participate in shaping their societies. The right of peaceful assembly is important in its own right, as it protects the ability of people to exercise individual autonomy in solidarity with others. 2, when enjoyed together with other rights, such as expression, the right to freedom of association and peaceful assembly constitutes the very foundation of a system of participatory governance based on democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and pluralism. According to the General Comment 37, peaceful assemblies can play a critical role in allowing participants to advance ideas and aspirational goals in the public domain and to establish the extent of support for or opposition to those ideas and goals. It further says that where they are used to air grievances, peaceful assemblies may create opportunities for the inclusive, participatory, and peaceful resolution of differences. Platform to advance other rights, peaceful assemblies and peaceful process and assemblies always have as their aim the call for the protection or realization of certain rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights by duty bearers. Peaceful protests, therefore, are necessary elements and platforms to advocate for the realization of human rights in a democracy. Through protests and peaceful assemblies, citizens are able to participate directly in the governance and shaping public policies in the spirit of fundamental objectives and directive principles of state policy in Section 14(2)(b) of the Constitution, which provides that the participation of the people in their government shall be ensured in accordance with the provisions of this Constitution. Accordingly, the National Human Rights Commission will be making the following recommendations, which are based on its powers to exercise its mandate under Section 5, paragraphs L, M, and O of its Enabling Act, and therefore makes the following recommendations. Policy recommendations. Obligations of the federal and state governments. The National Human Rights Commission urges the federal and state government to uphold the fundamental human rights and fundamental objectives of state policy enshrined in the Constitution of Nigeria. The federal and state government have obligations to facilitate peaceful assemblies by ensuring full protection of protests and assemblies. Full protection of protesters and assemblies. Federal and state governments shall ensure that protests are not disrupted by opposing third parties, counter-demonstrators, or hostile forces. Experience in the past has shown that when peaceful protests are going on, other forces come to interfere with these peaceful protests, and the impression is created as if these protests are no longer peaceful. The federal and state governments shall ensure that initial approaches to emerging violence that the initial approaches to emerging violence by protesters or counter-protesters does not immediately lead to the use of deadly force, and all measures to preserve human lives shall be ensured in accordance with international best practices. Now, we dwell on the obligations of the Nigerian police and law enforcement, security, and armed forces to ensure that there are peaceful protests. On the use of force, the law enforcement agents shall abide by the recommendations of the United Nations Code of Conduct for law enforcement officials and basic principles on the use of force and firearms by law enforcement officials. These principles specify that law enforcement officials must use force only when strictly necessary and to the extent required for the performance of their duty, and that the use of force should be exceptional and the use of firearms is considered an extreme measure. It also states that no law enforcement official may inflict, instigate, or tolerate any act of torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Law enforcement and security agencies shall respect the rights of protesters, including the right to peaceful assemblies, to convene assemblies, and to voice their opinions. They shall provide and protect traffic routes for protesters and non-protesters to ensure the right to freedom of movement are enjoyed by all parties. They shall provide protection for the public and private properties from protesters or counter-protesters. They shall ensure a prompt, impartial, and thorough investigation into any incidents of human rights violations during the protest. And for the protest leaders are to ensure that the protest is peaceful and avoid provocative actions such as carrying arms, hate speeches, attacks on law enforcement and security agencies, or looting of public or private properties. The protesters are to ensure that the protests remain peaceful and that they are law-abiding. That violence and destruction of property will undermine the legitimacy of the protests. While the right to protest is guaranteed, the protection of critical infrastructure is also very essential for us. The protest leaders are to cooperate with law enforcement agents to ensure peaceful protests and apprehension of any offenders. In conclusion, the National Human Rights Commission believes that through dialogue, respect for human rights, and adherence to the rule of law, it is possible to address the grievances of the protesters while maintaining public order. The National Human Rights Commission calls on all the parties to avoid actions that could endanger public safety or damage private and public properties, as well as undermine Nigeria's democracy. The National Human Rights Commission will deploy its protective and promotional mandate to monitor every protest in Nigeria and ensure that the aforementioned human rights principles are observed by state and non-state actors alike. And this advisory is issued this 31st day of July 2024. I wish Nigeria a very successful protest starting from August 1 to the end of the protest.
That one no follow.